Just as a quick background for folks who are listening in, we've got a program coming up with a rather formal title that can be simplified, but right now it's ethically informed licensing for artificial intelligence in self-driving cars and other consumer products. I think there's sort of a simpler, I'm going to quickly introduce our guests, but there's a simpler way to look at this, which is what's being left on the table when a consumer does a deal with I'll say a car company, an auto company for a self-driving car, and the same issues will apply probably with cell phones, and we'll get into that. But we've got distinguished guests with us today, starting on my screen, and I really don't know how Microsoft can present this, but let's start with Rob Laka, who is a professor down at Tulane in the business school. And Rob, can you give us just a Twitter-sized intro?
How many characters do I get, and did I have to pay for the blue check?
You got to pay for the blue check, yeah.
Okay. It took that blue check away from me. I was a little upset by that. Thanks for having me on. So I'm Rob Laka. I teach at Tulane. I run the entrepreneurship program here at the Freeman School of Business. So we teach students how to build startups and hopefully do some things that will make a good difference in the world. And so I've been teaching here for 7 years now. Before that, I had a career both as an entrepreneur myself, created my own venture and consulting firm. And before that, worked in the foundation world, was at the Howard G. Buffett Foundation, and then was at the U.S. State Department before that. So came to this work by being entrepreneurial in a number of different sectors, and really am passionate about moving across sectors to be able to create new value.
Just quickly, before we get to Nick, I was watching the show FBI last night, a recent episode in the State Department. A gentleman there was a spy. Were you a spy with the State Department?
I can't confirm nor deny. Come on.
Okay, perfect. Nick Matei, also professor, actually at the business school also, or just at the engineering school?
No, I'm just at the engineering school. So yeah, I'm just at the engineering. Yeah, so I'm Nick Matei. I'm an associate professor of computer science at Tulane. We are in the School of Science and Engineering, so we're not in the business school. But Rob and I have been on some panels before and talk a lot because we're both really interested in AI and building it and what it means for society, and also like what are some of the implications for it. And what are the opportunities there? And I think we both agree there's a lot of opportunities that technology brings, and it's really interesting to talk about those and talk about them with you.
Just quickly, you're also the head honcho of ethics with I want to say ACM, but did I get that right?
I have a few different hats. I'm on the so the ACM is the Association of Computing Machinists, which is the largest sort of interest group for computer science. I'm the co-chair of so that's broken down into like interest groups. So like the ABA, I know, has separate, sort of areas for different types of law. So much like ACM has different areas for different sort of technology things. So I'm the co-chair for the artificial intelligence interest group there, and I do a lot of things around that. We mostly like help organize events and underwrite conferences and all kinds of the more prosaic stuff. But it's a lot of fun. Get to see a lot of different sides.
We'll just go ahead on my notion that you're the ethics guru. How's that?
That sounds good. I did write a book on ethics, which is available on Amazon.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
I have
a podcast on entrepreneurship. You'd think I'd know something about that. So hopefully you've learned more.
Yep.
Eric Gottschling, the distinguished Eric Gottschling, who is not only with the auto industry, but a coffee drinker.
Yeah, and I have consumed more than my fair share. So I mean, it's kind of scary if I get a bluster up to about 300 words a minute. You should see me without caffeine. But yeah, I've been fortunate to be in the auto industry for a couple decades now, and just seeing some of the incredible changes that have happened in the industry. So looking forward to this podcast. This ought to be fun. And, I will promise not to fall asleep. I will just make sure that I have coffee nearby.
I have for you a new style of pour over coffee from the only U.S. retail outfit of what I believe is a Japanese coffee company called Ogawa. These are, I think they're fashioned after origami, but they're origami, do-it-yourself origami pour-over cups. So the pod is paper with little wings that come out that hang on your cup. Water's poured in, and I think you throw the whole thing away.
So you can take them with you on trips. That's fabulous.
And you and I are going to, we'll all be down there, but you and I will see each other longer. So I'm afraid they're going to get crushed though en route. So, okay, folks, so let's get started. So I appreciate you all being here. We'll be joined by Ian Ho perhaps today, but certainly at the conference itself. The premise for this, and I think that's the right word, is that for this whole discussion is that times they are a-changing, or maybe they're not, but they seem to be changing with self-driving cars, and I think I'm a little dated by saying also with mobile phones. And maybe I should really be saying with AI, and you folks can all clarify that. But it seems like smart devices are getting further and further into our lives. It started with these phones, which we could theoretically put down, though we never do. And it now certainly has extended to cars, but we have these, I'll call them sensorized devices that are full of sensors and with a lot of smarts that we keep with us, and now that we drive around. And that, I think, raises additional questions of exploitation of user data. And frankly, I don't really care about the privacy side for today. You may all, and we can get into it if you want to, but I'm interested in the value side of user data, exploitation from a value side perspective. And the questions that will come up and that people ought to have is what kind of data is being or could be exploited, whether it's by phones or cars, and do self-driving cars add to what the phones already provide? That is in terms of, or do they take from us as consumers any more than do phones take more than cars do, and vice versa? And legal constraints in general, I'm assuming there are certainly legal constraints from a privacy perspective on user data, but it seems like there aren't a lot of legal constraints otherwise on exploitation of user data. And the question is, should there be ethical, or are there ethical concerns that as vendors, whether it's the auto companies or whether it's the app providers, could be Apple, could be Google, who provide apps within the cars, probably also the folks who provide sensors have software. Are there ethical constraints, or should there be, on how they use user data? And would the right thinking company, that is a company that's thinking properly, ought they consider applying those ethics and at least telling the consumers about what's being taken, possibly better the value of it and paying for that? So that's the big picture. Hopefully it makes sense. And I'm going to turn to Rob and say, Rob, could you make some sense of that? Because you're in the business school and that's your job.
I'll try to. Well, thanks, David. I would say, just to start, we all sign terms of service agreement all the time that we never read. Right. So we always click accept, click OK with terms of service agreement that we would never read. We don't have time to. There's a study that's in my book that I cite that says if you actually tried to read through all the terms of service agreements that the average person sees on a daily basis, and you actually took that time, you'd be spending, and I forget the exact number, but it was many, many work weeks worth of time. Like, no one could do it. It is impractical. And I think the big tech companies want it to be that way. They don't want this to be easy for us to know what we're giving up. And I think that we, as broader culturally, societally, we have not reckoned with how much value we are giving up in the data that we are creating, and the data that is being used by these companies and then sold and resold on data marketplaces in ways that are really powerful. And so, the example that I use on this is that if you ever take an Uber, you assume that an Uber is that the company is getting some of that money, but that the Uber driver is getting the lion's share of that transaction, right? They're getting all of the tip, and they're getting the lion's share of how much ever money that you have paid for that Uber ride. And that's Probably true. It depends on how the math actually works out. That's probably true. And you have to keep in mind there are costs that aren't being accounted for, which is, the Uber drivers paying for the note on their car and the tires and the gas and, cleaning up if someone gets sick in the back or any of those things. They're covering all those issues. They're paying for the insurance. Still lots of costs, but at least in terms of the payment itself, you're getting the lion's share of the value from that transaction. And I would argue that that is true up until a certain point in history when then self-driving becomes the thing. And then once it does, those drivers have created quite a bit of value through that data that the company has gained over time, that then those drivers won't ever get a dividend off of. They won't get a data dividend. They won't get a share of the value of the data that had been created over that essentially a decade at this point. And so I think when we're thinking about how data is created and who benefits from that and who shares in that value, I think that's an interesting sort of place to start, is that, even if you say, look, I'm going to click on terms of service agreements and I'm getting the internet essentially for free. And so I don't mind that I'm giving up my data, and I don't mind that I'm giving up, any of that value, because that's the bargain I've struck by not reading those terms of service agreements. Maybe you don't feel as good if you then think about the value that's being created by a huge group of people who are spending, for many of them, the better part of their sort of prime earning years driving Ubers. But then if that shifts to self-driving, which is the topic we're discussing today, they don't share in the value of that data that allows that to be possible. And so I think that just broadly, these are some important conversations for us to have about what that's going to do in terms of labor, what that's going to do in terms of society, what that's going to do in terms of how we want to treat people. And I think as a business professor, that's a real challenge we need to reckon with.
And so, Nick, we've been, by the way, I didn't warn you what questions were going to come your way, so I'm just going to ask it. Why is AI any different? Why does it matter? Why is anything different now with self-driving cars and AI versus phones, mobile phones, whether they had AI or not? It feels like things have changed, but it may be that they didn't change, and I was simply forced to come up with a description and a title for this topic and decided it sounded controversial. Is it really?
That's a good question. It depends on how you want to define AI, which is one of these things that's been somewhat nebulous. I think since the beginning, since when AI even sort of gets coined as a term in the 1950s, it's not sort of a thing. It's more of a direction, right? So AI, broadly speaking, in the history of computer science, is whatever you do, sort of the act of trying to make the computer seem intelligent or give the impression of intelligence, which is really goes back to the Turing test. It's the whole point, is to make you seem smart. And so the way that I sort of interpret it, which is very broad, Big Ten, is saying anything you do that makes the computer seem more intelligent is AI. And that includes things like doing predictions from data, like basic linear regressions, doing all this stuff kind of dynamically and automatically. And I think nowadays, sort of the AI word is kind of the new buzzword, but it's, one is the sort of generative AI, right? So it's these text-to-text models that can generate new things. That's one piece of it. But when you ask the question, what's different from the phones and things like that, I would say not a lot, because we've already using AI to draw out patterns from the sensor data that we're getting from the phones. We've already been using AI to study traffic patterns. The Google traffic prediction that you get on your Google Maps, that's an AI layer on top of real-time data that's coming from everyone's cell phone, right? So it's doing some predictive analytics on top of just incredible amounts of real-time data to try to be able to predict traffic patterns. And so the AI layer on all of this information has been there, and it's been there for 20 years. We just now call it AI, and we all pay attention to it. So I'm not sure that there's a lot of a difference. I mean, unless we're going to talk about Gen AI, which is maybe the self-driving car will start talking to you. But in terms of what, I guess the question I think at the heart of it to me is, what is the value prop? Like you said at the top, David, was what is the value proposition of who gets to capture the value from that data? And I think one big thing for me that's been kind of interesting and sort of thinking about is, I think there's going to be, you talk about different people who are going to gain, people who are going to lose. One group of people who's going to lose is all these insurance companies, right? Because I don't know if anybody's noticed or not, but nowadays you have to opt into this all these different tracking devices on your phone. If you're with USAA, with your State Farm, Progressive, whatever, you're basically opting in on your phone, and you're sending continuous real-time data of your driving activities to your insurance provider that are then differentially pricing you based off their predictive AI algorithms for how much of a risk you are, how much of an insurance risk you are. And so that's already happening with your phone, right? So all the data, like how fast you stop, what route you take, whether or not you're speeding, I can get all that from your phone. But if we've got a self-driving car, that's going to be probably a much safer driver than you are. There's gonna be a big value shift. And one of the things I talk about in the book a lot is these individualized data streams allow us to disaggregate risk a lot better than we used to, because it used to be if you're under 25, you might get in a crash. So we're just going to price all of you together. And now we can individually price you. And you've seen this, if people get mad about this with like airlines, right? Like disaggregating their bundles, like all this other stuff. So all these data streams have let us do that. And then AI lets us exploit the pricing on that. And when we switch to self-driving cars, I think that's a big market that's going to change. Just making stuff up because I didn't know what the questions were going to be. But
that's okay. I make stuff up all the time. Eric, you're in the auto industry. Do you see, you're a user of a phone too. I think I've seen you with a cell phone from time to time.
Every once in a while.
Okay. So does the auto industry view the extra sensorization of cars and that goes with AI? Do they see this as a change, or they don't care about it at all? It's just give us our profit on each car and we'll just move on.
Well, I think that everybody's trying to chase more profitability, right? I mean, as you continue to have more and more pressure on any product, right, you're going to get more out into the market, which means there's going to be more price pressure. That's fine. So everybody's trying to figure out, how am I going to get a buck for 70 cents? And one of the ways to do that is to say, well, you know what, I'm going to sell this vehicle to you. And in exchange for that, you're going to do what Rob said, and you're going to sign this long form that kind of signs away all your rights. And I'm just going to do with that data whatever I want. So I think that one of the ethics concerns out there is, should there be at least some amount of disclosure associated with what am I giving away? I mean, personal information, I think, falls into a different category than maybe some of the other ones, because if personal information wasn't so valuable, everybody wouldn't be out there trying to steal it and hack it. So, when you look at it from that perspective, I think that falls into a different category, as opposed to, what is the car doing? How is the car interacting with other vehicles and so on and so forth? I can see all the benefit to that. I can see all the value that's created in it, as well as all the data. But, I do see this bifurcation of information as being something worthwhile for the consumer to be aware of.
So Rob, Rob, you're muted, but you seem to be, and I caught wind of this in our first conversation, you seem to be aimed in a slightly different direction with what you see as the interest points in this discussion. Can you restate it? Because in my mind, what Eric said was what I thought was the issue, which is ethically, should the consumer know the value of their data, and should that be part of the transaction? But you're going in a slightly different direction, and I can't quite put my finger on it.
Yeah, sure. I mean, actually, to bring together what Eric was talking about with what Nick was saying, Sergey Brin in November of 1997, this is on page 28 in my book, he worries about this. In 1997, he sends an email and he says, and I'll just read it out loud. It's, as scientists in the field of data mining, it's important for us to periodically take a step back from the technology and consider the ethics of using it. Auto insurance companies analyze accident data and set insurance rates of individuals according to age, gender, vehicle type. If they were allowed to by law, they would also use race, religion, handicap, and any other attributes they find are related to accident rate. Health insurance companies also use similar data. All of these can be seen as a result of data mining. They have a significant effect on people's lives. So that's what Sergey was saying in 97, before, when Google was still backrub, right? I mean, this is not anything that is, if it's new, it has at least been new in development for 3 decades. And if it's challenging to us, well, it's something that has been, a challenge for quite some time. And I think that that's something that we're just not reckoning with, is the point. Like this has been valuable data that's been gathered for a long, long time that has not been something that that people have really understood. I don't know how valuable my data is or has been worth to these companies. There's no transparency to that, right? I don't know ultimately like how it gets used and then resold and resold. There's no transparency to that, and that may be okay for people until they realize just the really intense sort of power and wealth that comes with that. And when you think about the value of the most important asset of the digital age, our data, that's just an interesting thing that we don't get any of the value of that for the most part, other than these products for free. But to be clear, like most of that freedom that we've seen from social media companies has been some serious risks too, especially for our children. And so when I think about like, what are the trade-offs that have been made? Who has been making those decisions? And where's the agency in that? I mean, I'm a free markets guy. Like, it doesn't feel like it's a very transparent free market because the value is being captured and that power is being wielded. And so I think that that's just an important conversation for us to all have.
Is it any different? Nick, I'm sorry, I think this is a repeat of the question. It is no different with phones versus cars, though, is it? Simply put?
I mean, at the end of the day, it depends on how many sensors we're going to be stuffing into the car, right? But I mean, the phones are pretty accurate. I think with the cars, you might be able to get more. I mean, if you want to engage in maybe not such the negative side, so let me try to be more positive about some of these things. Like if we sensorize the car, if you think of the car as a sensor platform, yes. There's all kinds of things you could do there that would be valuable, not just maybe to an individual or others, right? So cars are going to have, generally speaking, cameras all over them, especially LiDAR and all kinds of stuff like that. So you could probably real time evaluate the quality of roads in a city. Yes. If that data were to be turned over, let's say in a reasonable way to like civic infrastructure, something like that, you could, considering there's cameras on all these things, depending on what you're doing with the recordings of that, I know the city of New Orleans, especially, and a lot of other cities spend a lot of money on installing real-time crime cameras and aggregating that video information. So you now have a system of mobile networked cameras that are moving around your cities at all times. And so who gets that data? Right. And how is that data used either for, let's say, something like civic infrastructure, or for just like following Rob around when he's out driving around at night and we want to know where he is, right? So I think there are other sensors that you could put into a car that would be reasonable, that like belong there, so to speak. That's going to give you different types of data than the phone. But at the end of the day, there's a lot of similarities, right? There's going to be things like GPS tracks. Where do you go? How many people are there? How many people are parked at the Saints parking lot? What time did they all leave when they stopped playing very well last weekend? And so you're going to get those kinds of basic ones, but then, I think if you want to be positive here, which I like to try to be, and think creatively around, like, you've got this thing that's carrying a ton of sensors, like what could we use that for? I mean, you could be continuously monitoring the quality of your roadways, right? If you have sensors on the car, and something cool like that. So in terms of personal privacy and personal value, I don't know if there's a ton of difference, but there could be, I think, maybe greater civic value in some of the data that's coming off of a car.
Can we leave off everything you said seemed on point to me, but I'm tempted to leave off and Eric had already said this, the personal privacy stuff, because also, is it fair to assume that the personal stuff is not the issue? You're right. The car can collect data. The car knows it's being driven. So it's not a question of inferring from the speed of this thing that it's moving down a highway, or at least moving down a residential road as opposed to being run with, though I suppose you can infer that as well. So muted Rob, because you're in the business school, is it fair to ask you, going to Nick's point, so let's go to insurance and let's go to that. That's a great example. We all pay, I think we all still pay, except if you opt into, is it Progressive? I think with Progressive, you can actually opt in to have the Progressive insurance company. You can opt in to have them monitor how you drive, and I think they'll adjust your rates. But at least in general, we all pay rates averaged. What does, I'll refer to, is it Adam Smith who would have to weigh in on this? How does this all work in terms of, I mean, maybe Eric and I drive better and we deserve a better rate, but is there more slop in a system that is based on in an insurance premium system? They're called premiums, right? The payments you make every month. In that sort of system, is there more slop if the numbers are based on averages or if they're based on individual data? Is there an answer to that?
Yeah, I mean, just fundamentally the way these insurance pools work is that you're pooled in with people, and then they hopefully will end up making less payouts than the amount that they're bringing in from the risk pool, right? And so that's the way that it generally works. And I think that's what Sergey Brin was getting at, is that they're going to try and make that as efficient as possible and price you as competitively as possible in order to be able to ensure that that product is something that is both affordable, but also that they're making their largest margins as they can off of it. That's part of the way that works. I think the concern would be how specific can we get to this, and do we as a society, are we okay with things like, as he was pointing out in 97, handicap or other issues that we may not be as comfortable with, saying that you're able to sort of like charge someone a lot more because they're handicapped, for instance, or whatever else it may be. I mean, that's what he was essentially arguing in 97. I think that 30 years later, it's not just these demographic issues that we would look at. It's a whole wide range of different of basically everything you've done. We're pouring our sort of our existence into the internet, and that's something that is all being tracked. And so, I think that the thing with that is, like, whether it's insurance or anything else, like, what agency do we have to what gets shared and what doesn't get shared, and what are we comfortable with, and what do we even know? Because if you don't even know what's being shared or how that data is being used, and you have no ability to decide whether my Fitbit data, which is owned by Google, when I go for my runs, if that's getting sold to an insurance company or not, like, I don't know, right? So, like, maybe I'm okay with saying I want that data shared with better cardiac treatment for men in their 40s, because I want that to be able to help to improve science. That could be a choice I could make, and I could elect to do that. I don't get to choose that either, right? So I think that that's one of the questions we have, is like, when there's a lack of transparency and a lack of any sense of accountability, it doesn't get used for all the good purposes, like what Nick was saying, or the cardiac example I just gave. And it probably will be used to enrich some of the larger big tech companies, because that's something you just have to sort of basically assume that they're already doing with this data. I mean, that's the way I would look at that question.
Okay, so maybe Eric, just totally unfair to ask you this, but you can try. So why not as a consumer? Would you care? You are a consumer, so would you care if again, I say it's Progressive Insurance because we hear ads for them up here, and I think they will allow you to let them monitor your car and your usage to adjust your rates. Would you care as a consumer? How that? I mean, to me, maybe transparency is purely the issue. Maybe I'm missing something. You want to weigh in on that as a consumer and as somebody in the auto industry?
Well, the one thing I like that Rob said is that you really don't know, how it's being used. So I think, just like when you go on a website and you take a look at cookies, right? And you have to, strictly necessary ones, you don't get a choice. Okay, I can see that piece of it. But what about all the other ones that are optional to you, right? Should you have some ability to control that, as opposed to just, like you said, Google's going to put it together and they're going to say, hey, tech company XYZ, I've got all this great cardio data that I can sell to a biomed company. Well, wait a minute. I think that the issue is also one of downstream data, right? Is once the data is gone, you have no idea how it's going to be used. So I think that there is a certain element to that you've got to be careful about. And so, looking at it from a standpoint of, is there good that can happen in society? Absolutely. But at the end of the day, if I want to go out and eat a Big Mac, that should be my ability to do that, right? And Google shouldn't know or shouldn't have to know because I signed my life away on a 40-page document that I'm never going to read. So I think that there is some balance there that's got to happen, and we'll have to wait and see how that all plays out.
I see. So your point is, and maybe Nick, you can weigh in. I guess what your point is, Eric, that even if people knew what data was being collected and could opt in to have it collected from them in exchange for a benefit, for example, a lower rate on insurance or a lower rate on car lease, their data is now potentially out there with their identifier on it, and therefore maybe we don't want people to be able to do that. But this is a country where we allow people to carry guns because they, I mean, in other words, it's a free country, so why not? Nick, weigh in.
Yeah, I think so this is sort of this idea of like data ethics and like what the scope of an agreement is, has there's a long history in sort of this ethics of technology space. There's a very famous data set that gets used in data mining all the time about health data for a Pima Indian group. And it gets used for all these different things. And these folks were on a reservation and didn't understand what they were agreeing, that they were agreeing to in perpetuity, let their data just sort of live in this like NIH data set that people use forever. And you see this in a lot of different ways. A lot of times it's with medical more than anything else, but we're coming to an age where your activity, your purchasing, your driving, whatever it is, data can now live in perpetuity, like Rob was saying, in some database somewhere. And you don't know, not necessarily who's going to own it in the future. You don't know what it's going to be used for in the future, right? So it could be, when the aliens come and they decide that we're just going to eliminate all the bad drivers, right? Like those are going to be the first people we're just going to eject into space. You didn't know when you agreed to the collection that there was a future in which the aliens came and threw us all into space. And like, it sounds like a ridiculous example, but there's like actual real examples of this where like you agree to a data collection, there's no data termination. And then something changes in the world, and then all of a sudden you've agreed to be, all this information about you is out there, either you individually or you as an aggregated group. And I think that's why one of the things I think GDPR, which is the General Data Protection Regulation in the EU, got a lot of things right. They got a few things wrong, I'm sure. But like one of the things they talk about is like, the scope to recall your data, that you have the option to delete yourself from that data, right? So it is really kind of a bill of rights around a lot of the issues that we've been talking about here, about, retaining ownership and control. And this is a big, I think, I know in legal circles, like who owns the data? Do you own that data in a property sense? Do you own that data in some other sense? Is the company licensing it from you? Are they buying it from you? Like there's all kinds of very complicated stuff in there that I am not a lawyer, but I know it's things people think about.
Could you use the movie industry in a way when they film a movie, whether it's Scarlett Johansson or anyone else on the Avengers, which was probably the last movie I saw, that sort of data, that's what their voices sound like, how they act out a part, and they get royalties. So could you combine that with my favorite, blockchain? And is there a notion out there, Rob, you want to weigh in? Is there a notion that all data travels with a royalty obligation, or is that just unworkable?
No, it's totally workable. I mean, there are real innovations around data trusts using blockchain that I think are really interesting. I think the question is like, who will allow for that to happen and who will create the opportunities for that to happen? Well, the big tech companies that are in control of much of our data right now, they don't have an interest in that, right? And if the consumer demand isn't there, because there's just a lack of understanding of exactly how that data is used and repackaged and resold, if there's no consumer understanding and desire for that, then it's not going to come from that side of the marketplace either, right? A friend of mine, Tamika Tilleman, runs a group called Project Liberty, and he talks about is whether we are treated on the internet as citizens or serfs, with the notion being that these platforms, they're actually like treating us more like serfs than citizens. And that can be everything from, whether we post something that is not to their liking and then they delete it or cancel the account or whatever else without us having a say, whether that's one post or the entire account, right? Or even going over to the idea of if we're spending all this time and attention, that's valuable. And then also all of our data is valuable and all that content is valuable. And you're not sharing the value of all that that's being created, right? And so the idea there is that you're not being treated in that same way as a citizen. It's actually more of like you're doing work on somebody else's land on that platform, and then they're the ones that are reaping the benefits.
Is there any way to value that? Does anybody have? No, sorry, with that, I didn't restate. Let me restate that. Does anybody have the sense? And it could be Eric, but I'm guessing it's either going to be Nick or Rob. Does anybody have a sense of the amount of value created by the internet with a royalty obligation, or is that just unworkable?
Yeah, but it's not just the data brokers. It's not just that. I mean, the data is valuable in not just individual form or not just in the aggregated form that is sold on a available marketplace. The data is valuable to each of these companies. And, I often the counter argument, and I know Nick and I have talked about this before, is like, yeah, but what's the value of my data? My value, like, I'm not creating enough value for me to be able to, get all that much of that licensing agreement you're talking about, because I'm just one person amongst many millions. It's not valuable. But the point is that I would make is, yes, but the aggregate value is not created without all of these individual contributions. And if you don't allow for people to at least opt in, opt out, or have at least some agency and some knowledge, some understanding of what's going on, then you never get beyond that. The 6 or 7 big tech companies are the ones that then harvest all that value, right? So,
well, wait a minute. So you dismissed the notion, I think I caught you dismissing the notion of data brokerage as the term that would apply to. So you're saying there's not just value in data, in selling data from one business selling data to another business. There's value to the business itself in having that data. Okay, so in the old days, pre-internet, at bookstores, I bought 2 cookbooks this weekend, so I'm thinking about it, actual physical cookbooks. And so the woman at the counter sort of collected data on us. I mean, yeah, sure, she got our credit cards and all that. But more importantly, she had a sense that there were 2, I think it would be generous to say middle-aged, a middle-aged couple in front of them buying cookbooks and talking a little about it. So now she's got some data for the next possible sale, which is, oh yeah, I just saw a couple, they said they had X, I saw them buy it last week, and now this week they were buying Y. So that model's been around. So that strikes me as less bad, which is companies, or in this case, salespeople, collecting data about their own customers in order to be better at what they do seems less evil, but you're suggesting, Rob, that there's something I'm missing there.
Well, I just think that none of us understand just the amount of data that is gathered all of the time and the value of that data. That's the point that I'm making. And so it's not something you can reduce down to one transaction. It is something that is what Shujan Zuboff calls the surveillance capitalism, surveillance economy. And I think that's the point: is that like all of that is happening all the time, and there's just no knowledge amongst the general public about how much value that is creating for these companies, and how much of that they're contributing to. So Nick has strong opinions on this one, though.
Can that be solved, Nick? Can you, we'll get to Eric, but Nick, can you, from a computer science perspective, is it possible? Again, so we were saying blockchain wasn't really helpful for this, or monitoring the individual transactions may not be, because in the end, you're going to get 0.01 cents back on 3 years worth of internet transactions. It's hardly worth it. So perhaps simply opting in and opting out is the most power you can have. But Nick, is it possible to track all this stuff? Every damn piece of data?
Yeah, it is. I mean, we already do it, right? So in your example, I mean, there was court cases fought over stuff like this, about who has access to your library book history, who has access to your rental movie history. The difference of data, and it's easy for you to say, oh, the clerk might know that. Right. What's different today is my Kindle knows what hour I was reading the book. It knows what minute I was reading the book. It knows who in my household, which Kindle to which person read it at what times of day, or where I was when I was reading it. And it knows that for the millions and millions of customers that buy it on Kindle. Same thing for Netflix or whatever, right? It knows down to the second when you stopped watching a show. Whereas the retail clerk, she saw you buy it. She didn't know if you were given it as a gift, if you ever read it, if you even looked at it again. And so when you start asking those really deep questions, there's a lot of different things. And the thing is, they do track all this. We do track all this, and it does bring a lot of value to these companies. And you could track where that data is coming from. I think understanding what the true value of that data is really difficult, right? Like, how do you monetize that going forward? I mean, I think so for things like insurance, I think it's a little bit easier, right? You can actually look at your risk pools and how it pays out. But in terms of like, how important is it to know that like, people stopped watching a new series on Netflix at episode 4? Like, I don't know, right? I have no ability to price that information. And I think that's why not so much being able to pay is not a technical problem. I think it's more of a capitalism problem. Sorry, I hate to be like that business guy here, but I mean, I'm pretty pro business, but it's like, it's how does the business then move on to monetize that data in real and meaningful ways? And that's what a lot of this data is. And it's tough. I think it's not so much can you pay someone, it's how much do you pay them and how much do they actually enjoy, or how much value did you get from it, and evaluating that accurately, I think is really difficult.
Can you guys, I'm hearing, wait a minute, maybe I'm missing something. I'm hearing something different between Rob and Nick.
Uh-oh.
Not surprising. Wait a minute. So Rob, am I correct that your comments generally stand for the proposition that valuation is going to any individual is either going to be difficult or virtually meaningless from an economic perspective, and it's just a question of liberty, if that's the right term, which is simply deciding whether or not you want to play in the game. And Nick, on the other hand, seems to be suggesting there may in fact be value and that we ought to try to assess it.
Well, usually when we have this conversation, Nick's on the other side of that argument, saying that there's less value than I think there is. So this is funny. No, I would say actually that that we just don't know. We don't know. Like, I don't know how much value I've created for Facebook since I joined, because Yale was one of the earliest companies, or one of the earliest campuses to get Facebook when it was thefacebook.com, right after it was FaceMash, right? Like, I joined, 24 years ago or whatever it was, 23 years ago. I don't know the value that my activity has created for that company. And it's hard to value because I was a first mover who was contributing to that early on. So I was more of a contributor now than I am now when it's multi-billions of people that are on the platform, right? But like, I know there's something there, right? And I know that when I think about what have I gotten out of that? Well, yeah, I've stayed connected to people, and I've also not always been felt great about my experience from the platform, because it draws you in using the same types of experiences that casinos use to keep you clicking, and it sends nudges to you in a way that, as Nick said, are meant to sort of attract you in when you're most vulnerable. And it's literally, amplifying views that are more extreme that I worry about. So like, when I think about that company and what it has done in those last 23, 24 years, one, I would love to know the value that I had created through that for them. And then two, do I get any say on how that then gets used and how that has created a company that connects the world, but also causes many social concerns that like I look at and I don't feel great about, right? So I think this is all very complicated is the point, right? It's all networked. It is spider webbed. And so you touch one part of the web and the other parts ripple. And like, there is so little transparency. And so the answer is I don't know how much value that all of that data and all that content is, but I can tell you that the fact that I joined as one of the first people who was early on meant I created more value for that company than people who are joining today. I know that for sure. And so I think that's just important to try and think through and try and figure out as consumers.
So Eric, in the auto industry, if you had to, this feels so touchy-feely. I mean, this seems like this whole topic almost seems like a non-issue, or maybe it's not a non-issue. Maybe it's one of those things that for which we can't figure out the value, but with the right news report at the right time, with the right audience, you could create such outrage that there would be negative publicity. So thinking about Target, the data breach at Target, which resulted, years ago, which resulted in credit cards being exposed, I think we can pretty much assign value to that. There's probably risks, and we can all agree that's bad. But maybe the real downside, Eric, in your industry, would just be if there ever ends up being a public backlash as a result of a murder or maybe an election gone awry, that there's data being shared. We don't know its value, but we know it's bad. And so once that comes out and once it becomes clear that the tech companies have been party to something that ultimately proved evil, there will be negative value to that. There will be consequences. How would you, if that made sense to that, how would you advise, or what do you think would happen in the auto industry if you said, look, we don't need to do this, but maybe now is the time to come clean? Or how would the auto industry react? Let's come clean on where all this stuff is going, because we don't know how it plays out. We don't know its value, but we do know there is a potential risk to the company through negative publicity. I got that question out. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. I just don't know how you easily address it, other than to say, unless you're going to have a system that says the data goes no further than the company itself. I mean, I agree to give the data to that company. That's where it's got to stop. No downstream effect. I think that is one way of curtailing it, because I think both Nick and Rob, really said it well, is that we don't even know how much value we've created, because 20 years from now, somebody could say, oh man, look what we can do with that. We had no idea. Nobody even thought of that. And so all of a sudden, boom, and it's like, well, hey, I want a piece of that. Right? No. So I do think that there's some of that to go around.
So you guys, Nick and Rob, you don't have an answer to this? How disappointing.
Which part?
All of it. You're supposed to solve this. You're at a major university. You're supposed to have the answers.
Well, there's been interesting court cases in this space, right? Because I know when Waze went public, or when they sold to Google, right? There was a big lawsuit in Israel about people who were annotating all the maps for them, that were helping put stop signs in and stuff like that. And so there was a class action lawsuit over whether or not they had access to the value, because Waze sold for something a very large number of dollars. And so there was a big group of people who were helping them annotate maps in Israel that sued Google, Waze then Google, to try to recover some of that value, because they were like, look, we made meaningful contributions to the platform, and that was part of the value that was then purchased. And they were like, no, sorry, you don't get anything. So at the end of the day, I don't think, for better or for worse, this is whether or not, OpenAI can scrape all of the words off the internet or not, right? There's, and NYT and New York Times has to sue them for copyright. There's a lot of very sticky questions around ownership here, and around, he's talked about value sharing, and they're getting sorted out in the courts, because we're not passing meaningful regulation like they did in Europe. But then again, we also have a much more dynamic tech sector here, because we have somewhat less regulation around these things, and companies can try it out and see if it works. And so it's a very interesting balance to strike, and I think it's a lot more societal than it is technical in a lot of cases.
Let me chime in on that one, because I think one of the more interesting examples of this, which sort of ties together a lot of what we've been talking about, is a company called Clearview AI. So there's a Washington Post story just this past week on it, but this has been Kashmir Hill's book has been, very seriously bringing this to the fore. Basically all of your Instagram and Facebook photos, if they were ever public, not just if you made the account private at some point, but if you'd ever had your account be public, Clearview AI scraped all of those photos and built a database of all our faces, and are now used in police searches. And so when I was posting to Facebook in college, or even a few years ago, I'm not thinking that that's going to be used to surveil me and used to then, possibly implicate me in, oftentimes this is the challenge, implicate me in a crime I didn't commit and have me then arrested for that, which is what's happening far too often from what these news reports are saying. And so I think this is one of the challenges, is that we don't even know how that data gets used or misused. And we don't even know how that data, ends up being something that we don't even get to have the choice of whether that contract is being signed or not for our police to be surveilling people, because that's something that's done oftentimes without going to a vote, right? Something that's being done by, frankly, a government administrator who is unelected. And so I think these are the concerns that we should be discussing, because if we don't have these conversations now, then even more is going to happen in this type of space. And I think it's important for us to deal with.
We're going to pretend that we are doing our panel discussion, and we've been given the hook because it is now almost 4 o'clock. Eric's told me he's got a hard stop, and I think we committed to just 3 to 4. So this is unresolved, and I think if we kept up for another hour, it would still be unresolved.